Hello and welcome to the Momentum Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Dallin Malm. This podcast features conversations with athletes, artists, and entrepreneurs who use their success and influence to serve a purpose greater than themselves. My guest today has always been an engineer at heart. As an undergraduate at Utah State, he earned not one, but two bachelor's degrees, one in electrical engineering and the other in chemistry. And this did not satiate his appetite for opportunity. When he was accepted to MIT in Boston, he earned two master's degrees, one in engineering and the other in business. Absolutely insane. If you're watching this online, or if you saw the title of this episode on your phone, you know that this episode references my guest being what I call a multiplier, because that's exactly what he's been from the very beginning of his professional career. His colleagues, his coworkers, his shareholders, they've all regarded him not as the flashy idea guy, but more like the operator that people call when something important is broken. He's stepped into multiple nine-figure private equity turnarounds, taking on CEO and COO roles, and he's learned how to find hidden value by seeing what other people miss. It's because he's willing to get into the weeds to find things like inefficiencies or blind spots and pull on the few big levers that actually matter in an organization. This skill, what I'm calling a multiplier, it's carried him across a wide range of companies and industries in his career. It's resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in improvement and in value added for these companies. He now serves as the COO of Rebuild Manufacturing. It's a company that's piecing together a modern American industrial company where it integrates businesses and strengthens American manufacturing, proving that long-term building still matters in this country. In our conversation today, you'll hear how my guest, a self-described risk-averse person, ended up taking on some of the hardest assignments in business. We talk about why he thinks most failing companies are really just leadership problems and what it looks like to walk into chaos and bring order without pretending to have all the answers. We'll talk about business turnarounds, trust building, and the discipline of focusing on the two or three things that really matter. And I do have one serious regret from this conversation. Things were going so well, but we had a time constraint that cut our time much too short. So when you get to the end of this podcast, if it feels like it ends a little abruptly, well, that's because it was. Already, I think we have to schedule a part two to this conversation because it was phenomenal and there's so many more things that I want to get into with my guest. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Chad Clawson.
You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. Victory! Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there can be no survival.
You've described yourself to me as somebody who is really risk averse naturally.
Yes.
Yet your career trajectory has taken you through so many different companies. A lot of them as the CEO, COO, the founder, the partner, the investor. It's not really the career trajectory of somebody who's risk averse. At what point did you start to diverge and what brought you to be a little more tolerant to risk and new opportunity?
You know, I still think I'm risk averse, but maybe I need to define what that means in my case, right? So yes, I've done a lot of things that are risky in some instances, like I've been CEO of some turnarounds. Those don't always go well, right? But they feel a little less like, they feel more recoverable than other risks you might take, right? Like for example, at my age right now, if I mortgaged my house and took all my savings and put it into some business that it didn't work out, that would not be good, right? That would be risky. It might work out, but if it didn't, it would be pretty painful, right?
Yeah.
So I've taken a lot of risks in my career in the sense that I've taken on jobs that there's no guarantee that they're going to work out or that I'm going to be able to perform the way I'm expected to perform. But if they don't, it's not fatal, if you will.
Sure.
Right? So like working in private equity, I took on a lot of things that were difficult, but if they didn't work out, it wasn't the end of the world. And frankly, if they decided I wasn't good at what I did, I could go do something else. That's a different kind of risk than when I say I'm risk averse. It's more about taking my reputation or the wealth I've accumulated, let's say, or whatever, and putting that on the line. I'm risk averse in that way.
Yeah. Your first foray into this, we could say, was when you packed up everything into your car and you drove across the country to Massachusetts. Early on, you went to MIT, but you pursued a double major. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You got an MBA as well as a master's in engineering?
Yeah, electrical engineering.
Electrical engineering. Was the MBA always part of the plan for you?
No, it wasn't part of the plan. I loved engineering. In fact, I wouldn't say it's a regret, but I think I was pretty good at engineering, and just had a knack for it, for science and math and engineering and those kind of things, and I loved it. I actually took a lot of, like at Utah State University in my undergrad, I did 2 bachelors, just not because I wanted 2 bachelor's degrees, but one was chemistry, one was electrical engineering. I just loved to learn that stuff. I love physics, I love math, I love science. I just wanted to absorb it all like a sponge, right? That's what I loved. The reason I ended up doing an MBA is because when I sent for materials and application materials at MIT, right, to be accepted into the program there, I applied to the electrical engineering program, and when they sent me the packet of application materials, there was a flyer in there that talked about this double master's program at MIT, and my thinking at the time was, and what was attractive about it too was that it was all paid for, and going to MIT is real expensive, right? So I thought, wow, if I can get accepted into this program, the MBA is kind of icing on the cake. It's just like, it looks good on the wall, if you will, and maybe gives me some knowledge and skills that might be valuable in the future, but I wanted to be an engineer. But it was a way to get my school paid for, and it was a way to just get an extra degree in about the same amount of time as doing one. And so that's why I applied. I got accepted, but it was not ever part of the plan, actually.
But that MBA was invaluable in your development as a businessman, wouldn't you agree?
It was, but interestingly, so, I went to MIT, which is arguably the top engineering school in the world,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And did very well there. But interestingly, a lot of recruiters came to campus looking for engineers, and I interviewed for some of those jobs as well as some business jobs. And as weird as it may sound, a lot of them didn't take me seriously as an engineer because of this program I'd been to and the fact that I got an MBA. They were looking for real engineers, is the way they sometimes phrased it. And they wanted to know why I went to business school and why I went to this program, which was focused on manufacturing leadership. If I was a real engineer, it actually maybe inadvertently helped define my career trajectory, or I may have ended up in an engineering job because that's really what I liked. But yes, it's been invaluable in my career, both because of the learning, but maybe even more importantly, in some ways, the people that I met and became friends with. A lot of the things I've done in my career have been with people I met at MIT. We've worked together. We've invested in things together. The thing I'm doing right now is with a group of former MIT classmates, one of which was the former CEO of Amazon Consumer Business and was there from pretty early on in Amazon's development. And I wouldn't be involved with those people or had some of the opportunities I had I not gone there into that program. And so I think that's been as valuable to me as the education itself, actually.
That's pretty common to hear of people who go to schools like that, or the reason to pursue a really high-octane program is to put yourself around people that are really the top of their class, and it's those relationships that run the world, you could say, right?
Yeah, and I didn't do it for that reason. Like, that never really crossed my mind when I went there. I wanted the best education I could get, and that was the top school in engineering, and I'd wanted to go there since I was young. Maybe an interesting side note about that, it's amazing how little things we can do can have a big impact on others, and we may not even realize it. Years ago, I was working at a small business. This was while I was going to doing my undergraduate at Utah State University, and somebody I really respected who was an accountant. He had his own business, but he's also a CEO of a local company here. And he came in to audit our books, if you will. And he looked at me and said, "Wow, where did you learn to do accounting?" And I said, "Nobody taught me. I just figured it out." And he said, "Wow, you're really smart. You ought to go to MIT." That was exactly what he said to me. Now, for him, it was probably just kind of a comment he didn't think a lot about. He may have even been joking, right? But like, it made me think, yeah, I should, like, something I kind of wanted to do but hadn't thought a lot about. I really should set that as a goal. And this was pretty early on in my undergraduate. I was only maybe a year or so into my undergraduate program. But that one comment helped me set a goal to go to MIT, actually. And so I think I worked extra hard and tried to figure out what kind of profile would get accepted in MIT beyond grades and other things, right? And I deliberately worked towards that goal. And it was because of this comment, this highly respected friend of mine, who very successful person, just made a kind of a passing comment to me, and it inspired me to go do all that, right?
So you've written this about yourself. You talk about how you are good at finding hidden value and opportunities.
Yeah.
I think it's like a core specialty of yours. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that and give me some examples of when you used that skill early on in your career, whether it was in your time at MIT or Utah State or shortly after.
Wow, that's a hard one. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that, Dallin. Like, I do think that that's true, but usually I'm a very logical person, right? I'm very good at things like math and science. I'm very logical in my thinking. I'm very fact-based. I'm not super creative. So I don't know that I've unlocked a lot of value ever in that kind of way, right? Where I've like come up with some fantastic idea and gone off and done it. But I think what I'm really good at is seeing inefficiencies, seeing inconsistencies, things that don't make sense, seeing where people's thinking are just off, right? In 2013, as I recall, right, we acquired this business. I was part of a large, I'll call it a private equity firm, right? We acquired a business, $450 million in revenue. It was losing 28 million, minus 28 million of profit, right? Burning cash like crazy. We acquired that business for almost nothing. I think we paid 10.8 million for it, and sold it 3 years later for 340 million, right? And what was interesting about that is the people who owned it before us had tried for some time to fix it, right? But I don't think that they really could see a path to fix it. They weren't pulling the right levers. And part of that is like when you're involved in something for a long time, you can not really you start to become blind to other possibilities. You sort of accept things as they are, I guess. But we went in there and like literally in, I think it was 3 or 4 months, I know it was less than 6 months, we got it to break even, like very quickly, right? And I think there were just a lot of things they were doing that didn't make sense, that were costing them a lot of money. There were big levers they could pull, financial levers, like simple things like negotiating better pricing with suppliers. I mean, they were the biggest HVAC company in the United States at the time, and they weren't using that leverage to sort of pit, if you will, different suppliers against each other to try to get better pricing. And so just simple things like that. So when I say, I have maybe an eye for unlocking value, it's more like that, just like being able to identify the things that matter most, because it's really easy to get caught up in a lot of things that, there's a lot of things going on in a business, like hundreds and hundreds or thousands of things. Today, I get hundreds of emails a day, right? It's really easy to get lost in that and staying very focused on the things that are going to have the highest impact. That's true in life too, by the way. But like, what is going to have the most impact on this situation or this business or this relationship or whatever it is? Like being able to recognize that and then make sure you spend time on that. This is not rocket science, right? If you read Stephen Covey's 7 Principles, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about beginning with the end in mind and putting first things first, right? This isn't rocket science, but a lot of people I just don't think do that, right? I think one thing that separates successful people from less successful people is that knack of being able to focus on what really matters, right? And not sweating the little stuff. Now, sometimes the little stuff matters, but not sweating the little stuff, right? And just staying highly focused on the things that matter, being able to identify what those things are, and then being able to make sure you spend sufficient time and energy on them to make the most of those things and pull those big levers. I've spent a lot of time in my career doing turnaround work where you go into companies that are struggling, and there's 100 things or 1,000 things you can do in those kind of situations, right? I've told lots of people that what I do is I pick 2 or 3 big levers to pull. Like, what are the 2 or 3 things that if we change or we do well, or what are those things that will have the most impact? And then just do those. I spent a lot of time in private equity. Private equity has a pretty short-term focus generally. Now, anything I was involved in, we never did a lot of short-term things at the expense of long-term things. I personally just refused to do that, right? So any improvement we made, we tried to make the business better for the next owner, but you still didn't have a lot of time to do it. And especially in a turnaround situation, especially if you're burning a lot of cash, investors don't have a lot of patience to keep putting money in, right? So you have to move pretty quickly. So I think just being able to say, like, I'm not going to sweat the little stuff. If I do these 2 or 3 things and don't worry about a lot of other things too much, and I do them well, it will have a huge impact. And so
there's an interesting skill that comes with being able to turn around a business. So a lot of times you were put at the helm of that project as like the CEO, as a part of the company. I'm curious if you could take me through maybe an example of the scenario that you found yourself in one of these turnaround situations, and if you could give me some specifics on how you were able to get the wheels back on the wagon, so to say. Because what's interesting about this is you're taking it's a solvable problem. Mm-hmm. You're not putting an impossible equation up on the board and people are just banging their heads against the wall trying to figure it out. It's a solvable problem, but there's the power of a fresh perspective, a different operating system, and then there's advantages that come in, whether that's in the terms of money or counsel or experience on the leadership board. There's just certain things that you can plug in to bring this thing back to life. Mm-hmm. Can you color in some of the details on your experience in one of those? I know you've been a part of a lot of them.
Yeah, I will. The thing about this is when I maybe give an example or two, it will seem obvious, right? And so people say, why do you even have him on your podcast? Because like anybody could do this, right? but I'll give you an example. I won't name the name of the company just out of respect for the people involved. But I was once sent into a company that made personalized, I'll call them trinkets. If you go to somewhere like Yellowstone and you have a keychain that has different names on it, right? Steve and Bob and Barb or whatever, right? They made a lot of that kind of stuff. A fairly sizable company, right? And I was sent in there because they were losing a lot of money. And by the way, other people had worked on this company for quite a while. And when I walked in, there were already a couple of other people that were sent there before me that were, working to fix the company, right? They were very focused on revenue growth, right? Like, we got to sell more. How do we sell more? How can we get in more accounts? How can we, right? And there's the old adage, I guess you'd say, like, you're losing money, but you're going to make it up in volume, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, they were really focused on that. So I went in and just took a fresh set of eyes. It's always easy with a fresh set of eyes, right? I've often found that sometimes being naive is good in a way because you ask a lot of questions that people that aren't naive won't ask, right? Because you plain don't know. So you'll ask, why are you doing that? And nobody else is asking it because to them it's obvious that's just how you do things, right? Anyway, a lot of time had been put into this company to try to fix it. And I went in there and just found some crazy things going on. Like, the reason they were losing money, and everybody should have known this, but I think the year before I went in there, they'd thrown away $10 million of inventory, right? That's about what their losses were, right? So they were just throwing stuff away. And I think at the time they thought this is a one-time thing, right? But then as we were looking at inventory the next year, there was a whole bunch of stuff we needed to throw away again. And they were just doing, honestly, with all due respect to the people there, and I think they were trying to do a good job and they were trying to do what they thought was right, they were just doing crazy things. So let me give you a quick example, right? So they were selling, like, let's just assume keychains, for example, right? And so they start at Adam and they work to Z, right? And they were selling they call them trees, right? You sell the display and you line them up with all these names, right? And they were selling these things, and when people would reorder, like people might run out of Steve because it's a common name, but there'd still be Chads. That's my name, right? There'd be a lot of Chads still sitting on there because Chad, at least at the time, wasn't a common name. So they would, in that industry, to compete, you have to be willing to take back unsold inventory, right? So people would want to send their Chads back, right? So they'd send their Chads back and they'd order more Steves. Well, somebody, got this idea. They had all this excess Chad inventory in this case, right? So how do we get rid of it? We don't want to throw it away. So they got this bright idea that next time they sent out a whole kit, they'd put less Steves in it and more Chads in it. And that way they'd get rid of the Chad inventory, right? Without thinking through, they're still not going to sell at the end. Like the people at the end aren't going to buy Chads because that's not their name.
Yeah.
And so they thought they were boosting sales and they thought they were getting rid of obsolete inventory. But what it did is it just delayed the problem, and it exacerbated the problem because the MRP system would say, wow, you're selling a ton of Chads. We need to order even more. They'd order more and just keep doing that. It's like this vicious cycle. And all of a sudden you end up with $1 million, I'm exaggerating, but $1 million worth of Chad inventory you can't get rid of. Now you got to throw it away, right? It's very obvious, but to the people involved, it wasn't. And part of it was like nobody was looking at the whole system. You had somebody like responsible for inventory that's like, I got to get rid of this stuff, right? Hey, here's an idea of how I'm going to go do that. But that person's not necessarily aware of like how the whole system works. And at the end, there's no Chads to buy the Chads, right? And people aren't going to buy a Chad if they're named Steve. And so I sometimes think that just that kind of end-to-end view, and again, thinking logically, like what actually drives the sale? It's if somebody has that name. And if they don't have that name, they're not going to buy it. It doesn't matter how many you put in a box and ship out. But that's just an example of something that seems obvious, but to the however many hundred people involved in that business, it wasn't. And this had been going on for a while.
Had they just not been asking the right questions? They had the ability to see the whole 10,000-foot view, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they had the power to do that. They owned the company.
Yeah.
Why were they not? Because what this is just an issue of clearing a logjam.
Yeah, I talked about focusing on the things that really matter, but I also think sometimes people don't drill deep enough, right? So if you think about, I don't know exactly how this came about, because when I came in, it was obvious to me, but you could definitely envision somebody in the company being, I'll just say beat up, because I use that term a lot, right? Beat up for inventory. Like we got way too much inventory, you got to get rid of it, right? And that person saying, okay, I'm going to work it down, right? But them them being under a lot of pressure to do it and not having a full view of it, or in some cases maybe even realizing it's a dumb idea, but they feel a lot of pressure to do it and they don't see another way out. That's unethical, but that can happen, right? And then you can see somebody else, let's say at the top, that's really focused on a lot of other things. This inventory thing's a problem. We just threw away all of our bad stuff, right? Don't let it happen again. And the people involved saying, okay, we won't, right? But not realizing, well, the ERP system still thinks you need this stuff. You just threw it away, but you didn't, right? And nobody really owns the whole process, and nobody's drilling deep enough. So even though I said you need to pull 2 or 3 big levers, in the case of that company, that was the lever. Like we had to fix the inventory problem. You fix that, you fix a big part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
But when you pick the levers, you got to pick the right ones, but then you got to drill down. Like nobody knew this problem was going on. They didn't know, right? Because everybody saw a piece of it. And my assumption is that nobody like really drilled down. They maybe asked a lot of questions of people, but they never really drilled down to understand the whole process and how it was working. Like that process focus is very important, right? How does the whole process work, right? I won't name the company, but there was recently another company that owned some software companies that serviced a certain industry, and they thought buying more software companies in the same industry that did other things, right? So I'll make up a fictitious example, but let's say you had software in your house that ran your thermostat, right? And I owned the company that provided that software, and I thought, you know what? If I buy a software company that runs your oven, right? now I can sell them to you as a package, right? It wasn't anything quite that simple, right? But their strategy was like, we're going to buy more software companies that sell into the same companies that provide a bigger suite of products for those companies. And so that's what they did. The problem was that they didn't understand, and we make mistakes, right? The problem was they didn't understand how the buying cycle at these large companies that was buying this kind of software worked. And the people making the decisions on one package were totally different than the people making the decisions on the other package. There was no synergy. You couldn't sell them as a whole overall package because that's not how the buyer bought them, right? So if my wife, in this simple example, dealt with the oven, right, and I dealt with the thermostat, and we were very divided, like, you can't sell us a software package that does both, so to speak, right? They didn't understand that about the customer. Now, mistakes are made, so I'm not saying they should have known that. But I often find that where people make mistakes, at least in business, is they really don't understand the process end to end. Like, who's buying that? How do they make the decisions? If we buy another software company, is it really going to be leveraged? Do we talk to our customers about it? Do we just assume it is? Do we understand the mechanics of how they make a decision? A lot of times that's where people go wrong, is they don't really understand the process from end to end, right?
Is it common to run into a failure of leadership as far as the culture they established? Like, for example, like they would never would have said this explicitly, but by their actions, they basically taught, we don't need to get into the weeds here. Would you chalk that up to like a leadership failure or something else?
I think, I don't know if I can say 100% of the time, because there sometimes are cases that are just outside your control, right? Your building gets destroyed by a tornado. That's not a leadership failure per se. Now, if you didn't have insurance, it is, right? but I would say almost every single time when a company is in trouble or gets off base or fails strategically, like somebody else comes in and takes market share away from them, or there's some new technology that comes out that obsoletes the way they're doing business or obsoletes their product, I would say almost 100% of the time that's a leadership failure. And I say that recognizing that doesn't mean that the leader is bad or not smart or anything else, right? We can, sometimes things are just hard, right? If I've invested, like if you think about Kodak as a case example, Kodak had the edge in they owned the patents on digital photography, right? But they didn't think the resolution was and it wasn't at the time, the resolution wasn't as good as it was film, right? Film was much higher resolution than digital. I don't know whether or not they realized that over time that would change or not. But they ended up selling that to other companies, right? They could have owned digital photography, at least for a while, until the patents ran out, right? But the other thing that makes the decision hard, it's a leadership failure for sure, right? But the thing that makes it really hard, and why you have to not be too judgmental of leadership, is they had billions and billions and billions of dollars invested in these plants and processes, right, to make film. And making film is not easy. If you ever went to Kodak Park, at least back in the day, the thing was huge. And I don't know how many billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars were put into that. And they owned a big chunk of that market. To walk away from that, like to actually not just walk away, but to like promote something that obsoletes all that capital investment and all that know-how is really hard. But it's still a leadership failure, right? It's easy in hindsight to see that, so we have to be careful not to be too judgmental, but it's always a leadership failure.
Sure. John Maxwell teaches everything rises and falls on leadership.
Yeah.
And that can be taken very simple, and then in this situation, it's just a little more complex, but the principle is the same. So you remind me of this excerpt from...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but there's a man I really respect. He passed away a few years ago, but Don Davis, he was at MIT, right? And he used to run the Stanley Works, right? The Stanley garage door opener company. But, you know, he said, he taught a leadership seminar at MIT when I was there, and he said, leadership, I'm trying to remember exactly how he said it, but he said, leadership isn't, now I started down the path, I don't remember, but he said, it's the only thing. So I forget how he started that, but leadership isn't important, it's the only thing. And I just slaughtered what he actually said. But the point was, like, it all comes down to leadership.
Yeah.
Always.
And leadership is influence, and that influence is done through example, primarily it's shared through example, but it changes the way that you think, it changes the way people react, changes the way that people take accountability. A good leader can do an amazing thing, which is why I think, in part, why doing turnarounds is so fascinating, because you've taken something that's great, and in my world, if there's something that I can't do or I'm having a really hard time with, and then somebody walks in the front door and they take care of it, it's so frustrating to me, because I'm like, the answer was there. Like this is a solvable problem and I couldn't figure it out. And so to do that and fix it by leadership is interesting. Like you said, there's no silver bullet or no magic question or no magic strategy. It's mostly just, it's kind of, the answer is actually kind of boring.
Yeah. Dallin, you're my friend, so this might hurt a little bit, but like, I actually think that frustration can be a limiting factor, right? Because I think a big part of being an effective leader, and just effective in life, frankly, is a certain amount of humility. And being frustrated you couldn't solve a problem is not a sign of lack of humility per se. But I think that it can cause people to feel like they need to solve every problem, which can be limited as a leader, right? Because it can consume a lot of time that you don't have, right? And I just think a certain amount of humility, like, okay, I didn't solve the problem. Somebody else said, great, right? That's awesome. Like, I'm glad they solved that. Good for them. They were able to contribute. They were able to add value. I didn't have to worry about it, right? So I understand the frustration, right? Because I find myself in that boat, especially if I had been one of these companies I was talking about that couldn't see the forest for the trees. I would probably feel maybe even a little embarrassed about that, not to mention, ashamed maybe that I couldn't figure it out. But I think that, not being able to solve a problem, somebody else solving it can be a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right.
I do agree with that. I think the competitive nature would say different, but
Right.
I think that's right. I think that's true. And as you gave an interesting, go ahead.
Competitive, yes, but competitive as a team, right?
Sure.
And in fact, if you want to be a really competitive leader, it's more about the team, right? So I'm very competitive too. And if we had time, I could tell you a story about that. But I'm very competitive too. But
I'd love to hear it.
I might embarrass some people by telling it, but I'll tell you. You may have heard this story before, but some years ago, I was playing on a commercial basketball team, right? And I was older, and I wasn't as athletic as I used to be.
Like, this was your company's basketball team?
It was actually not my company's. It was a good friend of mine. His dad owned a business, and he sponsored our commercial basketball team. And I played until I was fairly old. Like, I was the second oldest person in the local leagues here, the city leagues, right? Playing. So I played until I was fairly old. But, I wasn't as athletic as I used to be. And we had a really good team. Like, we were really good. And quite often we would go through the regular season. And there were 4 seasons. You play year round, right? So spring, summer, winter, fall. So we'd play 4 seasons, if you will, a year, as I recall. And we were really good. And there were times where we went undefeated during the regular season, but we wouldn't win the championship when we got to the tournament, right? And so one day I happened to be reading the newspaper. That's something old people like me used to do, Dallin. And I noticed they had the scores for the games. And I saw our team had played and had won a game, right? And I thought, oh, I didn't even know we were playing, right? So I called the person who kind of was in charge of the team, if you will, right? And I said, hey, I didn't realize we were playing. Like, when's our next game? And he got kind of really sheepish, right? And he said, well, my dad, who paid for the team, right, decided we needed younger legs, right? Like, we needed younger legs in the middle, right, than you. And so we've decided not to have you on our team going forward. We've got somebody else on the team. And I could tell he felt really bad about it. These are friends of mine, right?
Yeah.
And I almost feel like, I don't know whether he agreed with the decision or not, but anyway, I could tell he felt bad about it, right? Well, my competitive nature was such that that I said, okay, I'll show you. So I called the person in Logan that ran the league and said, can I get a team in? And he said, it just so happens we have an odd number of teams, so every week there's a bye. So yeah, I can fit you in, but you lost your first game, you forfeit. And I said, I don't care. Get me a team in, I'll figure it out, right? So he put us in, and I literally called a bunch of has-beens, and maybe I was a has-been, right? But a bunch of people I used to play with before that really hadn't played for quite a while. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them hadn't played basketball for several years. But they were people I used to play with that used to be really good. And I called them, said, do you want to play? And they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. And anyway, we even named our team a name that implied we were out to get this old team of mine, right? Now, I bared them no ill will.
You don't remember the name, or you don't want to share
it? I do,
it?
but I'd rather not share it. But anyway, our name was deliberately meant to show we were coming after them, right?
Yeah.
So think about, let's say the name of the team would have been...
it would have been like Beat Walmart or something like that.
Bob's Repair. Ours was Bob's Repair Carnage.
Got
right?
it.
So we were going to destroy them, right? So anyway, but I love those guys. So I didn't bear them ill will, but I was very competitive. I'm like, I'm going to show you guys, right? My only goal was to beat them. That was it. I didn't care if we won any other games or not, right? So I pulled this very ragtag team together. And anyway, we played them. Not only did we beat them, as I recall, we beat them by a fair margin, right? It just turns out that then they asked me the next time to play with them again, right? They put me back on the team. So no ill will to them. They have no ill will toward me, but that's how competitive I was. It's like, you don't think I can play? I'm going to show you I can play, and I'm going to put a team together that can beat your team. And so I'm a little less that way than I used to be, but I understand competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there has to be some type of a competitive itch to succeed. But going back to what we were saying earlier, there's a common... So one thing that I'm hearing from this conversation is you got to keep the main thing.
Yeah.
And you have to be competitive enough to chase it. You have to be humble enough to take a step back when you're when you're not there. When I was at the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting this last year, when Warren Buffett announced he was stepping down, actually, and he has this line that's like burned into my brain. And you imagine Berkshire Hathaway, hundreds of billions of dollars in cash in the bank, like liquid.
Yeah.
They can do anything in the world. And Warren Buffett said, we don't have to go in and take charge of every situation in every industry. He said, if we're looking at an interesting opportunity and there's a lot of competition, he said, we keep the white flag at the ready and we will happily wave it high over our heads because A, I know that I can outlast them, and B, I know that we can outspend them when the time really counts.
Yeah.
So the core competency of Berkshire can stay intact, and they don't have to. It reminded me of this quote from Dan Wang. He wrote this book called Breakneck recently, comparing U.S. and China. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not.
So he compares China during COVID, Chinese manufacturers compared to American manufacturers, and this is so interesting. And when you were talking about Kodak kind of bringing themselves out of relevance, they reminded me of this story. He said, I remember that I was going up to a factory manager in Shanghai, and in our conversation, he marveled to me that American manufacturers didn't get their act together to produce really important goods like PPE. In this guy's formulation, too many American companies asked themselves whether making masks and cotton swabs was part of their core competence. And for very few companies, that's their core competence, so they didn't make it.
Yeah.
Chinese companies say that making money is their core competence. So making money is the competence.
Yeah.
Therefore, they go and they make what the market demands, which at that time was masks and cotton swabs. So I was grabbing masks made by Foxconn, which normally makes iPhones, and by JD.com, one of China's biggest e-commerce retailers. They just decided to retool a lot of their factory lines to produce what the market needed. Then there was some complacency and lack of hustle amongst American manufacturers to actually produce these things. So the ability to keep the main thing, and it maybe in the case of Kodak, it was like success is spelled survival in a lot of those fast paced, and they just kind of got outpaced. Have you found that at companies that you've gone to where you've had to come in and be like, guys, I know that we've pursued a lot of these. You've pursued a lot of these things that are good in their own respect, but this is the main thing. Like, if this company does not make money, we're all out of a job. Do you have to sit before a board and say something like that at times?
Yeah, I do, but I want to take something you said, what you just read about China, and I'm not a China expert by any means, but an interesting thing about that versus America is I don't know if it's just keeping the main thing, but because of labor costs in China, right, you can throw a lot of bodies at things, right? And not just labor costs, a lot of things are just cheaper in China. Like you can buy tooling from China way cheaper than you get it made in the US. So if you think about even China can be really responsive on things, right? If you send China a drawing, they can typically respond faster than an American company. I don't know exactly how they do it, but I envision it's you can have just a person that you're paying very low wage to just focus on that one drawing, right? You can have overcapacity, you can have all kinds of things. You can't really have that in the US, right? It just costs too much. So I think there's a lot of things they can do in China because of the low cost nature that probably aren't super efficient, but they still can compete on the global stage.
They're effective.
They're effective, right? If I paid way less for inputs, I could be, I'm not saying they're wasteful, but they could be wasteful and I could still be competitive, right? So
Sure.
I think that's part of the equation there too. But the answer to your question is yes. There's times where deciding what to stop doing can be just as important as deciding what to keep doing. And sometimes it's not just keeping the main thing. Sometimes it's changing what the main thing is, right? I was involved in a company years ago. We were funding a company that was acquiring brands that go into like stores, like think like somebody buying Campbell's soup or something, right? So they had a bunch of brands that they sold in grocery stores and other places, and they acquired a company that it was a soup brand. It was actually Bear Creek Soup, right? And so they acquired that, and Bear Creek Soup, their soups like were really viral at the time, if you will, right? And doing really well. But they had a whole bunch of other products they were selling, right? And it took a lot of effort and time. They weren't selling that well. They had a lot of inventory. They had a lot of additional processes to make those products, and they just weren't selling that well, right? Now, potentially they could have turned that around at some point, right? But this wasn't my decision, but what the CEO of the company that bought Bear Creek Soup decided to do is like, I'm not doing all that stuff. And in his case, and I didn't agree with him on this, but he may have been right, I'm not going to even manufacture anymore because this stuff was being manufactured here in Utah. He's like, I don't even want that complication. Like there are people out there in the world, co-packers, that are way more efficient than we can be, that can get better, prices on raw materials, that can get that are more efficient at manufacturing than we are at our volumes. And I'm just going to focus on the soups, and I'm not going to do the manufacturing anymore. And that was a big boon to them, right? Now, some might argue like, well, maybe you could have penetrated all these other markets and so forth, but like it reduced a ton of costs. I think the performance in terms of what they had in stock when they needed it and stuff was better. And so that's an example of just stopping doing something that's not really what your core is. In his case, in his business, his core wasn't making stuff. So a lot of the other stuff he sold, he didn't make any of it, right? So for him, taking on manufacturing was something that wasn't part of his core competency, nor did he want it to be, nor did he have necessarily the personal experience to know how to do it. And he's like, I'm going to focus on what I do well, which is promoting and selling brands through these different retail channels. And that's what I'm focused on. That's my core competency. And everything else I'm just going to drop, right? And in that case, it worked out really well for him, at least at the time. I don't know how it is now, right?
Yeah.
But
let me ask you one more question on this, and then I want to move on to something else. When the news finally reached your ears that you would be appointed as the CEO of a company, to bring about a turnaround, can you walk me through that first week or two on the job? We'll say, how do you structure your time? What kind of meetings do you hold? What questions are you asking? What are you looking for, trying to dig out as you start your first couple of weeks in this new assignment?
yeah, so the first things I do, if I haven't done it before I start, some of it I may have done before I started, but I first try to understand. The first thing I focus on, honestly, the main thing is the people, right? I'm a new CEO. They may be apprehensive about that or not, right? They may have hated the prior CEO, or the company may be in trouble and they're like, maybe somebody can come fix this. But whatever the situation is, right? Setting the right tone with the people is important, because again, it's not about solving all the problems yourself. It's about building a team, or having a team that will follow you, that will give you honest feedback. One thing I found in my career, a lot of people won't tell the CEO, it's the emperor has no clothes thing, right? Like, a lot of people won't tell the CEO what they're actually thinking, especially if the CEO comes across very strongly, right? Like, even if the CEO isn't like totally sold on their own ideas, like they don't, even if they're willing to change their mind, if they come across as the too strongly in the way they think about things and they believe things, it'll shut people down, right? And a lot of people worry about their jobs, or worry about how they're perceived or whatever, and they won't often say what needs to be said. They're afraid to, right? They're afraid to disagree. They're afraid to complain, if you will, right? They're afraid to even bring forth good ideas, because they're maybe afraid not that they'll get in trouble, but they'll get shot down and they'll feel bad, right? So I found the biggest thing when you first go into any company, especially a turnaround, is building trust with the employees, right? Setting the right tone, making sure that they know that you don't think you have all the answers, making sure that you create a culture where people are free to disagree as long as they do it respectfully, right? That no idea is a bad idea, right? That mistakes are okay as long as you thought through it and it wasn't a dumb mistake, right? Because you were being lazy, right? And just setting that tone with people, because once you have the confidence of the people, they know what you're about. They know that they can trust you. They know that you have their back to the extent you can. Sometimes you have to maybe cut a bunch of people out because you can't afford them, right? I've always been very truthful with people about that. Like, some people say don't tell them because people may start leaving. But what I've done in those situations said, look, if we can't do X, Y, Z, I may have to cut some costs, right? What I've done is the people I know I want to keep, I'll tell them you're not on that list, right? But I just think being very open and honest with people and transparent with people, my number one personal core value in any situation, but certainly in business, is integrity, right? You don't have integrity, you don't have anything. And I know there are successful people financially that don't have integrity, but I don't think you can be successful in every way that matters without integrity, right? So you have to have integrity, and I think transparency is my second core value, like being very transparent with people, being very honest, because you can have integrity, just not say anything, so you have to be transparent too. But I found that's the most important thing, right? Once you establish that, then you have people that will tell you what needs to be changed, that will follow you anywhere, that will get things done, right? That you can have discussions and dialogue with. So that's my number one thing. The second thing is trying to identify what those big levers are, right? And you need the people's help to do that. So if you don't first establish trust and set the right tone and all that, it's going to take you a lot longer to figure out what those levers are, right? But if you establish the trust and the rapport and the confidence of the people, and they're willing to help you do what needs to be done, then you can more quickly identify those levers, and you can more quickly pull the levers because they're on board with that and they understand why you're doing it, and they'll help you do it, right? So that's how I approach those things. And that could be true in a turnaround, but also a healthy company. Right?
Of course, yeah. It sounds like a good practice for any leadership, really, running any size organization. Can you think of an example where you had to combat and fix power dynamics or just politics inside of a business itself to allow it to function more smoothly?
I'm trying to think of a specific example, but yes, I don't think you can tolerate that, right? So I think you first start out like coaching. If you see that, you tell people like, this isn't going to work and this is why, right? If people persist, I'm a pretty nice guy most of the time, but there are times when I just lay down the law, and that would be one where I'd lay down the law. If I see those things limiting the performance of business, I just say, well, this isn't acceptable, and it might be, if somebody can't operate in the kind of environment you need them to operate in, if they're too worried about themselves, too worried about politics, too worried about climbing the ladder, too worried about how they look, then they probably don't belong there long term, right? And so I would talk to them about that. I'm trying to think of specific examples of that. I know I've had them, but I think, again, if you set the right tone coming in and you just enforce that, not necessarily by just reprimanding people that don't do what you need them to do, but really by just continual coaching and pointing out, it's actually interesting, if people that are like too political, they're doing it for a reason. And the best way to combat that is to give more attention and kudos to the people that don't do that, right? Because usually people that are being political, it's a very selfish thing, and they want to look good, or they want to build their own power structure, their own empire, whatever. If you actually give the attention and the empire and the kudos to the people that aren't political, it sometimes fixes that. By the way, this is something I wanted to say, and I just mentioned it. I think I've phrased this different ways, but I think every single regret I have in my life, and I don't have millions of them, right? But every single regret I have in my personal and professional life, right, come down to selfishness. I can't think of a single regret I have that my actions or lack of actions weren't motivated by selfishness, right, in some way. And so for me, like, an attempt to not be selfish, because I think to some extent it's in our DNA to be a little bit selfish, right? It's survival instinct almost. But to me, the selfishness is the root of almost every ill in the world, and maybe every ill except, natural things like diseases, right? But almost every ill in the world, I think, is caused by selfishness, and every regret in my life, I think I can say that pretty certainly, every regret in my life has come from me being selfish in some way, selfish with my time, whatever it was. It could be I wanted to look good, so I maybe early in my career told a little mistruth to look good, right? All my regrets are from selfishness.
Was that something that was pointed out to you, or that you came to realize on your own?
No, because actually when I was younger, I actually think I was pretty good at maybe people might not have known I was being selfish, right?
Okay.
It's something I came, because as you get older, I probably should have been smarter when I was younger, but you get older and you look back, right? I had a very wise person once tell me, if consequences were immediate, there would be no bad people in the world, right? This was somebody I worked for some years ago. If consequences were immediate, there'd be no bad people in the world, right? And so I think sometimes things you do, there can be immediate consequence. You can feel bad about something. If I yelled at my kid because I was in a bad mood, I may feel bad about it pretty quickly, right? But a lot of consequences don't show up for a while, right?
Yeah.
So as you get older, as I just review my life and things like, maybe some of the seeds I sowed have grown now, and they're not all wheat. Some of them are tares, right? But just as you get older and you reflect, and you realize that you've made mistakes, small and big, right? Just as I've reflected on it, I thought, what is the root cause of that, right? And I phrased it in different ways, but one way I would phrase that is selfishness. It's all come down to, and I think I've just realized that. I don't think anybody's ever pointed that out to me.
What I like about that is in the process of self-reflection.
Oh, except for maybe my wife.
That's right, yeah. In this process of self-reflection, it's one of the things that makes us better and better as time goes on. Mm-hmm. The older we get, maybe less better in athletics, but I don't know, but you might beg to differ. But it makes us more effective people, better leaders. Our attention spans are a little bit longer. Our patience has the ability to be stretched a little bit farther.
Yeah.
And you're taking this experience, all that you've learned, and you are using it now to build a new company, rebuild manufacturing.
Yeah.
The stated goal is to bring manufacturing back to America, to help restore a lot of that greatness that built our country.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of interesting companies that are owned by Rebuild. One of them is Slate Trucks, which I know that you've worked a lot with yourself and are really passionate about.
Just for clarity, Rebuild doesn't own Slate Trucks. We own a part of it, right? We spun it out. But yes, that was incubated at Rebuild Manufacturing. It was the idea of our CEO, Miles Arnone, who's a longtime friend of mine. I met at MIT.
MIT guy, right?
Brilliant guy. If not the smartest guy I know, one of the smartest guys I know. And that was his idea. He pushed really hard to get that approved by our board so that we could do it internally to rebuild manufacturing. We incubated it, demonstrated that it was possible to create a vehicle kind of at the price point we wanted. And then because of the need for a lot of capital and the desire not to bank too much of our company on that, we spun it out and got external investors. So we still own a portion of that. There are members of, like our CEO Miles are known as on that board, but it's not really owned by us, right? And yes, I had a hand in that, but it was a pretty minor hand. This is where I don't like talking about myself. I supported the development. Like a lot of that was done at one of our companies that reports to me, one of our member companies, and I supported that. But it was really Miles and some of our other board members, Jeff Wilkie of Amazon fame and others that really, and Will Barker, who's awesome, one of my favorite people in the world. They are the ones that really, like, I played a very, very, very minor role in that. But it's really cool. They're going to launch the vehicle within the next year. I don't know the exact timing. They'll start selling it, right? I'm pretty excited about that. It's getting a lot of really positive press. I actually have the Car and Driver article right here sitting on my desk.
That's awesome.
About it.
You have one ordered for yourself, I assume?
Yeah, I do. There's been some debate about who gets vehicle number one. This is interesting too. Rebuild manufacturing really, yes, it is to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. That's a big part of our purpose. But the reason for that may not be clear to everybody, right? It's not about just building a company. It's about creating a pathway to a better way of life for more people, right? If you think about like working in fast food, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But honestly, like after a couple weeks, you've learned almost everything you're going to learn about that, right? It's hard to keep improving your skill. So you're not becoming more valuable over time, generally speaking, right? Maybe you'll be the manager someday in that way, but like as long as you're flipping burgers, so to speak, like you're only going to get so good at it, right? So you're only going to be able to create so much value. That's not true in other things like manufacturing, right? You can get better and better at it for a long time, and therefore you can increase your value, which generally means you're going to add more value to the economy and to society, but also more value to yourself. You're going to be more valuable, right? So we want to provide that path, but we also believe that democracy relies on people having economic opportunities, right? If you look at a lot of times when people have gone authoritarian, right, it's because they don't have hope, and right, democracy is not working for them in their mind. Now they may not have a full understanding of the long-term consequences of rallying behind some authoritarian figure and throwing democracy aside, but that's why democracies fail, right? Is people are looking for somebody to come in and save them because a free market, capitalism, and democracy isn't working for them. So we want to try to do our part to preserve democracy in this country by providing that path. But, an interesting thing about Slate is born of this philosophy of helping people, right? It's not born of the philosophy of making money, although, our investors want us to, and we certainly hope we will and think we will. But it's born of this idea of helping people. So not only do we hope we create a whole bunch of jobs in this country making the vehicles, but it's cheap and very reliable transportation for people. If you think about somebody, like even for economic opportunities, if you live, let's say, in some inner city where maybe there isn't a lot of economic opportunities in your neighborhood, how do you get to and from work if you have to commute, right? And how do you, so this is meant to enable that, right? This is a relatively inexpensive, very reliable vehicle that will allow people to, so it creates jobs. It also creates transportation for people that maybe otherwise couldn't afford it, right? So it's dual purpose. But the reason I started down this path is because, I said there was some debate, sort of joking debate about who gets vehicle number one, right? Because it's kind of cool to get vehicle number one. And I think there's a general feeling that Miles Arnone, it was his idea, should get vehicle number one. But I don't know who will get vehicle number one. I still think Miles should get it, and I think we ought to force it on him because it was his idea. But, he's the one that wants to do this to benefit society, this whole rebuild thing, including Slate and a bunch of other things we're doing, right? He actually said he thinks vehicle number one ought to go to somebody that doesn't have any money, right? That's where vehicle number one belongs because that's why we're doing it. And to his credit, right? So I still think he should get it, but that's the kind of person he is, and that's what we're about. We're about making people's lives better, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
This conversation definitely needs a part two. There is
only this part, because you're going to dump the rest of this.
there is a lot to unpack here still with Rebuild, and we've only talked about a tiny part of a company that you partially own. But due to the lack of time today, I want to give you the final question that I give to all my guests.
Okay.
And it's this: what's the kindest thing anyone's done for you?
Wow. There's a lot of kind things that people have done for me, but I have to say, not because it's expected, right? My wife, she's done some big things for me, but wow, just every single day, right? Every single day she does things that people may say she shouldn't even have to do. It's old school, right? Does my laundry and folds it, makes dinner. For years, I've traveled a lot in my career, which, by the way, that was a little bit selfish too. That's one of my regrets. That might be my biggest regret. Like, I've had a wonderful, fantastic career in many respects. I've met a lot of cool people. I think I've done some good in the world and left things better than I found them. Done well financially and all those kind of things. And I've tried to always set a good example of like good principles as I've done that. But, if I had to go back and do it over again, I think I would have chose a different path. I think I still could have done a lot of those things without all the traveling, right? And she never complained, rarely, right? Rarely complained. But man, I was on the road a lot. There was many, many years where I would get on a plane almost every week on Monday morning and come home Thursday night and be home Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then back on a plane almost every week, right? And man, that put a lot of burden on her, right? Like raising the kids, taking care of the house. I mean, she always wanted, when I got home, I'm going to almost cry here, Dallin, but like, she always wanted to make sure, like, when I got home that we could spend family time. So even things that I maybe was doing before I started traveling, like yard work, she would do all the yard work. She would do everything so that when I got home, we could go play on the weekends, right? It was a huge burden on her. We had 7 kids, right, that she was taking care of while I was gone. So that was a big thing she did, just allowing me to go do that. But just every day, right? Every day, just kind things, right? And she's just that kind of person anyway. Like, I don't know anybody that does more for more people than she does, and most people don't even know. She's just the kindest person. But I don't know any one big thing, but just every single day, kind things for me. But the most kind things in general, without calling people out, are just when people give me words of encouragement, right? And one kind thing that might not seem kind, we don't have time to go into it, but years ago, right, not long after I was out of MIT, I was asked to give a presentation to a group of investors, and I sort of misunderstood what the goal was, and I used the word "I" too much because I kind of thought that's what they wanted, right? And I could tell something was wrong in my presentation, like something was just off, but I didn't know what it was, right? And even though it was a reprimand in a way, this very extremely successful person I just respected a ton, that had started this private equity firm that's now very, very large, right? He was a very successful CEO, partner in this firm. He just pulled me aside and very gently, said, let me tell you what you did wrong, right? So I could have taken that hard if my pride would have been too much in the way, but that was a very kind thing, to be willing to pull me aside, not get all over my case, not just say, you made us look really bad in front of all our investors, because I probably kind of did, but just pull me aside and say, recognize that I have potential, that I didn't just blow my life because I made a mistake, and just pull me aside and explain to me what I did. And that lesson has stuck with me, not just the lesson to not make it all about me, which was burned into my head, right? But just his kindness and the way he dealt with that, right? But yeah, lots of kindness. I think a lot of our success in life is because of kind things that people have done for our parents, whatever. People that get like abused or berated or whatever, like sometimes they rise. I'm not just talking about in business, right? But a lot of times they just struggle in life, right? Because they're mistreated. Their ego's destroyed. Not their ego, but their confidence is destroyed. Their self-esteem is destroyed. They don't trust other people because of things that have happened to them, right? And I think kindness, along with lack of selfishness, kindness is just so important.
I totally agree. This is a good place to end the conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast on Instagram at the handle Momentum Theory Pod, where I'll be announcing new episodes weekly, as well as sharing my top takeaways from every conversation. As always, I invite you to please share this episode with anyone you think could benefit from the conversation. So long for now, and thank you for tuning in.